The Corporative State by Joaquin Azpiazu, S.J. Chapter 4. The Framework of the Corporative Society. 1. The Idea of Christian Solidarism. The Christian idea of solidarism does not precisely date from Pius XI. As conceived regarding the theory of ends, that is, with regard to the need of coordinating the individual end and the social end in every act of human life in the field of Catholic sociology, it has always existed. But it emerged most clearly in the days of the rigid individualism which practically denied such a union and coordination of ends. Leo XIII, in his encyclical Rerum Novarum, set it forth clearly, but Pius XI defined it still more clearly in Quadragesimo anno. The greatest interpreter of the social thought of Leo XIII, Professor Toniolo, has brilliantly outlined the exact meaning of solidarism and states that, together with the individual conscience with its own special interests, and together with society and its general interests, there appears, is trained, and reaffirms itself the consciousness of solidarism. That is, the knowledge that the most complete particular good of individuals is obtained through the general good of society, subordinating, therefore, one's own good to one's neighbor's good, as a sort of homage to a superior moral law. In this are found the ultimate reason for being and the ultimate sanction. No less interesting are the studies of the German economist Heinrich Pesch on the opinions on Christian solidarism. Toniolo and Pesch appear among the Christian economists and sociologists as the chief promoters and propagators of this idea of solidarism. Giuseppe Toniolo was the Italian professor so well known because of his works, his management of the Italian social weeks, and his magnificent practical collaboration in the work of Leo XIII. The Jesuit Heinrich Pesch, died 1926, belonged to a family of scholars. His brother Hermann was a theologian of the first rank, and his other brother, Tillmann, was the author of outstanding philosophical treatises. Heinrich studied sociology and economics under A. Wagner, and at his death left several most important works, quoted several times in this book. In 1898, he discussed corporative organization and solidarism in a pamphlet entitled Liberalismus, Sozialismus und christliche Gesellschaftsordnung. A good part of his fundamental plan is to be sought, perhaps, in the fact that he was a follower of Father Theodor Meyer. Because of his ideas, Father Pesch was considered an anti-capitalist, and his work is denounced in great part by all the enemies of the regime, or else is regarded as of small value. 2. The theory of Christian solidarism, the idea and finality of solidarism. Solidarism is a social economic system which assumes society organized morally and organically and at the same time requires the organization of the national economy in accordance with the juridico-social principle of solidarism. It assumes, therefore, two foundations. First, the organization of society not as grouping of atoms but as a basis for other entities or smaller societies, after the manner of cells, like the family. Secondly, the organization of the national economy in accordance with the solidary principle. First of all, what is the principle of solidarism? It is a juridico-social principle which guides man toward freely associating in his life the personal end of his social life with the social end of his personal life. A few words in explanation. Man, as an individual, has a personal end of his own, which is the guiding principle of his life, of his acts. But at the same time, as a social being, he has a social end in all his acts. Hence, all during his life, he has continually to associate the two ends and subordinate them or coordinate them in accordance with the importance of each. Solidarism, therefore, is eminently anti-individualistic, since it exacts the perpetual completion of a social objective which is inherent in man and indispensable to him. At the same time, it is eminently anti-socialistic, since it continually exacts the completion and development of the personal aim in every act of life. The purpose of solidarism is the common good, which we try to unfold and develop to the maximum limit through the different elements that exist together in society. Naturally, those found on the highest level of society, whether in the order of authority, juridical branch, or in the employer order, economic branch, must contribute more actively in conformity with their mission and the importance of their task to this development of the common good. Thus, in acts of authority, there must be a predominance of the social end over the personal end. Conversely, in the acts of the subject, there is generally a greater predominance of the personal end over the social end. Likewise, in the economic order, acts of the employer, because of his greater influence and broader field of action, attain or should attain a social goal more fully than the acts of the workers who are under him. Despite this coordination or subordination of aims, as the case may be, all individuals should develop the personal end and the social end, since, if capital and authority have the greater social role, work also has its social function with its inherent social repercussions in all life. The principal commodity that solidarism tries to obtain is the full realization of social justice. And as social justice tends precisely toward the enlargement, development, and attainment of the common good in the maximum sphere of its dominion, so the obtaining of social justice, so stoutly defended in Pius XI's Quadragesimo anno, is the best means for the development of the common good. Solidarism, as determined by the juridical order, the institutional order, the economic order, and the social order, is the base and foundation of rights. The examination of each of these aspects will help us to complete the doctrine of solidarism. Christian solidarism in the juridical order. As the base and foundation of rights, solidarism begins with the study of the individual, whom it regards as the beginning and the end of all economic juridical order. So considered, the individual is the source of right, with which God endowed him when he formed his personality. In the economic order, the individual is the fountainhead who is to perfect every economic system, and who in turn will be perfected through the development of economics. Accordingly, solidarism starts with the study of the individual himself in his most intimate desires, which are a. In the spiritual order, freedom, on which his personality and his value depend. B. In the emotional order, his stimuli, and hence his adequacy and his yearning for perfection. C. In the purely economic order, a desire for property so that, by means of it, he may attain a maximum utility. Christian solidarism studies the individual at the same time as inseparably united with the society in which he lives, and which perfects him in all aspects of life. And in thus considering him united with society, it makes him realize the end he is to attain as an individual in the life of society, by fulfilling his duties and exercising his rights, as well as the social objective by the use of the rights and duties of his individual life. From this double consideration of the individual, there arises a standard of right that we may call a solidary union, which defines the relationship of individuals with each other and with respect to society. And as the moving principle of this solidary juridical order, we have the principle of solidarity, the ontological principle of social life. Thus, by this union and coordination of the double finality, the individual has a life of right and of duty with respect to himself and to society. A. Solidarism unites the individual's own freedom with that of his neighbor, or, which is the same thing, the freedom of the individual with the social order. B. At the same time, it serves as a basis for the union of the free personality of the individual with the society in which he must live. Compare the vast difference between solidarity in the juridical order with socialism and individualism. Christian solidarism in the institutional order. When solidarism begins with the rights of the individual, it recognizes as primary the right to associate with other individuals for all the lawful purposes of life. All manner of associations, such as family, civil, or professional associations, therefore come to mind. Solidarism realizes that society, in view of its intentional purpose, which differs from the particular ends of individuals, is not the sum total of them all, nor is it simply a mechanical grouping of individuals. If the right to associate is a natural one, it logically follows that an association that arises owing to this right shall be free and untrammeled if it functions within the proper limits for which it has been called together. Therefore, it needs no natural society, born from the need of the right of association, no power even though it is called the state, to govern and administer itself. Some of the associations thus formed in conformity with this right of association are necessary for the maintenance of social life, for instance, the family. Others are advantageous or very useful for the development of the several social ends that men and societies may fill. The aggregate of these natural societies is what makes up civil society, which, according to the idea of solidarism, is not a society composed of isolated individuals, but of the orderly, systematic grouping of other smaller societies. Like the family and municipalities, they unify, are intercrossed by other societies, still smaller too, after the manner of professional societies which live in civil society. We might compare it to a huge, highly perfected machine, which because of its complexity contains within it other complete machines and motors that would increase the power of the whole machine. If the machine were taken apart, the smaller ones could go on functioning independently. Similarly, after civil society disappears, the smaller ones could remain as municipalities. They assuredly would remain living their own lives as social cells, the family, and other analogous entities. Socialism in the institutional order proceeds very differently. It begins by attributing absolute power to the state and denying any power to the entities and associations which have a life of their own in civil life. Individualism begins in a way similar to solidarism, but goes astray immediately. It recognizes individual rights and therefore the right of association, but by an obvious contradiction, it denies to these societies, for the very reason that they are not individuals, all right to regulate and organize themselves freely. It authorizes them only by permission from the power of the sovereign state. Hence, in an individualistic regime, professional associations can have no other life but that which comes from the approval and vitalization of the state itself. The state, like an executioner, holds in its hands the iron collar ready to strangle all syndicalistic liberties, no matter what their motivation may be. Christian solidarism in the economic order. According to Christian solidarism, the fundamental principle of solidarism prevailing among men in the juridical and institutional order must likewise exist in the economic aspect between the two principal factors of production, capital and labor. Thus, as men must strive, according to solidarism, toward a personal and a social purpose or end, so do capital and labor have a double function, an individual and a social function. This double end and function of property and of labor is treated in a limited way in the encyclical Quadragesimo anno. Property, or capital, according to this doctrine, cannot be used or consumed according to the unrestrained judgment of the capitalist, but so that its use will, in some way, favor social welfare, or the common weal. This social function of property, in general, constrains all the more when a. The property, or capital, is larger, b. The degree of intelligence of the social mass is greater, c. The gulf separating the very rich from the very poor is greater, d. The relationship, or the more intimate, the bonds that bind the capitalist to the workers closer. These bonds may be of blood, race, or nationality. Lined up before the individual and social function of property stands the double social and individual function of labor. According to these ideas, labor is not something isolated that benefits only the worker. It has its social function for the benefit of society, and, as the worker is not an isolated being but is encased in society itself, his labor and its consequences influence the rest of the laboring mass, all capital, and all consumers. The social function of labor, therefore, constrains the worker in a way similar to the way the social function of property constrains the capitalist. Since capital and labor are the two chief factors in production, and since economic progress comes from their understanding of each other, so far as economic progress contributes to social welfare, it is just that solidarism, whose proper end is the commonweal of society through a full attainment of social justice, should try to unite these two factors, capital and labor, as far as possible, so that an equal profit may accrue to each. For this purpose, solidarism acts so that capital and property, the desire for which is felt by all men, a. shall be apportioned in the best possible way, if possible, among all, b. as a consequence, the present existing division of a few immensely rich men on the one hand, and an enormous mass sunk in the greatest indigence on the other, will disappear. This is the doctrine of Leo XIII, who expressed the hope that all men will be proprietors. He declared that work is a moral obligation of society. Work is good in itself, and sanctifies society, and is noble, since Christ sanctified it. That is also the doctrine of Pius XI, who maintains that one of the economic causes which aggravate the social problem is the bad distribution of goods, making a very few immensely rich and reducing many more to beggary. They must be harmonized in the maximum economic income of both, and in the maximum attainment of the welfare of society. Both conditions are functions of the solidary ideal, functions that can go together. But if either one were to be sacrificed, it would of course have to be the first for the benefit of the second. Or equivalently, a greater social welfare in an inferior economic order would be preferable to the opposite. Individualism has behaved in a very different fashion in the economic order. It has granted to capital the highest honors within its system. It has completely ignored the social function. It has reduced labor to the category of a piece of merchandise to be bought or sold by a mere contract. So individualism only united capital and labor at the moment of production and separated them afterwards as though they were irreconcilable enemies. In fact, it has divorced capital from labor. Socialism, acting with still greater violence, came as a reaction against individualism. It saw that capital and labor were divorced, and it separated them still more. It put capital into the hands of a single rich person, the state, and made all other men who feel a desire for wealth live condemned to the proletariat, unable to emerge from it by fertilizing capital with their sweat, working always for the state, and never being able to obtain any portion of the desired capital. Individualism threw society out of gear when it accumulated wealth in the hands of the few. Socialism brought the idea that there should be only one rich person, the state. Individualism sowed discord when it multiplied proletarians, unable to improve their condition. In socialism, everyone will be proletarian, and no one will ever be able even to hope for a change in his condition. The social aspect of Christian solidarism. Every social system tends, by its very nature, to raise and improve society by giving full satisfaction to the legitimate aspirations of its component parts, and reality to improvements in every field, within the bounds of maximum freedom and by bringing about perfect social justice. A Christian social system must tend, by its very nature, to raise the largest and neediest class, the laboring class, by opening up possibilities for the improvement of their social life. Leo XIII in Rerum Novarum and Pius XI in Quadragesimo anno tend particularly to set this rise on a firm Christian foundation. One of Pius XI's chapters is headed Redemption of the Proletariat, or a better translation would be The Rise of the Proletariat. How does Pius XI propose to bring about this redemption of the proletariat? Simply by giving the proletariat access to ownership. To put it graphically, by the deproletarianization of the proletariat. This deproletarianization will undo the evil accomplished by individualism and socialism. Individualism, by means of unchecked competition and unbridled selfishness, has brought on the economic dictatorship of the few and the poverty of the many, Pius XI. Socialism has imposed the dogma of the reduction of all to the condition of proletarians. Christian solidarism seeks, if this is possible, the raising of the proletariat to a higher status. This does not mean that labor is to disappear. Quite the contrary, for labor, mechanized and ill-treated by individualism and socialism, is established in law and is regarded by solidarism as a moral duty of society, and by Christian solidarism is raised to the moral category of something worthy and holy. Labor was indeed something necessary to individualism, but it was abject. In socialism, it is obligatory, but has no standing. In Christian solidarism, labor, because it is human labor, is immensely superior to all other economic goods in the world because these latter can never be human. Nor will this bring on the disappearance of classes, since, in view of human inequality, different human aptitudes and different kinds of labor will always differentiate into classes. It does, however, wish the differentiation to decrease, and especially it desires that the classes which are now proletarian rise to a much higher level of life, and one more worthy of man than at present. This goal will be attained by the proletariat being raised out of its present status, thanks to the influence of Christian solidarism. In the restoration of the social order, a restorative principle must be sought, one that will be a model to be followed by the whole social organization. What will this model be? Can it be the principle of unrestrained competition in the economic world? No, says Pius XI, because that principle leads necessarily to economic dictatorship and to the crushing of labor. It strangles real liberty in the very name of liberty. Can it be the principle of the class struggle? Still less so, for that anti-Christian and unjust struggle leads to a state dictatorship, to a class dictatorship. Pius XI. What can it be? The principle is this: recognizing the universal human brotherhood, the needs and the necessity for mutual aid that all men have, we shall all work toward the attainment of our individual and social ends through the establishment of a strong union among men themselves and in the professional sphere. Pius XI. This is the fundamental principle of Christian solidarism, a principle and a system which, as we have shown, have two fundamental characteristics: cooperativism in all branches and professional corporativism. It will be noted how Cooperativism, which requires some union of capital and labor between the partners, cannot be socialist but must be anti-socialist, and how corporativism is eminently anti-individualistic and eminently anti-socialist. Conclusion. As we have seen in this brief exposition, solidarism has two principal ends. One is the re-establishment of the social organism with full and perfect autonomy, independent of the state. The other end is the re-establishment of the social, economic guiding principle, which is the principle of aid, of union, of compenetration, and of solidarity supported by all men and social organizations among themselves. Pius XI says in his encyclical Quadragesimo anno, having re-established the members of the social organism and restored the directive principle of the economic social world, in a certain manner the words of the apostle concerning the mystical body of Christ can be applied to this social body, the whole body, being closely joined and knit together through every joint of the system according to the functioning in due measure of each single part, derives its increase to the building up of itself in love. One cannot fail to recognize that the truth of all this had been already sketched in outline by several Christian economists, among whom I shall quote the most authoritative, Heinrich Pesch. Solidarism, he says, in general is a social system that gives just value, the value that corresponds to the human being in society, to the solidary union of men as such and as members of the natural societies, both family and state. At the same time, it requires a development that is most suitable to the needs of the times, the most abundant development possible, through a strong community feeling within a just, cooperative, representative, corporative, orderly association, and according to the profession and civil condition. Heinrich Pesch, Lehrbuch der Nationalökonomie,